You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 5,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The first time I killed a god, I threw up until blood came out of my nose. My name is Dorian Kells, and for 23 years, I've hunted things that wear divinity like a stolen coat. They slip into our world through the cracks in broken hearts, speaking in voices that sound like childhood lullabies and offering miracles that taste like poison candy. The price is always your soul. The payment plan varies. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a warning. And if you're hearing this, chances are you're already being watched. December 15th, 1999. Cambridge University, 3 days before winter break. Snow fell on Gothic spires while students packed for home, their laughter echoing through corridors that had witnessed 8 centuries of human ambition. I was 32, unmarried, and so devoted to my theological studies that my colleagues joked I'd marry the library if it would have me. Professor Edmund Hartley changed all that with 5 words. Dorian, would you assist me tonight? I'd known Edmund for 6 years. He was brilliant, kind, and possessed the rare gift of making ancient religious texts feel as immediate as morning news. His lectures on comparative theology drew standing room crowds, and his office always smelled like Earl Grey and leather-bound wisdom. That night, his office reeked of sulphur and something else, something organic that made my stomach clench. "Close the door," he said without looking at me. His normally immaculate appearance was dishevelled, his silver hair wild and his hands shaking as he arranged candles in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The floor had been painted with symbols that seemed to writhe when I wasn't focusing on them. In the centre sat a photograph of Rebecca, his daughter who died of leukemia 3 years earlier. She'd been 7 years old, with gap-toothed smiles and crayon drawings that covered Edmund's office walls. "Edmund, what is this?" I asked, but he was already beginning to speak. The words that poured from his mouth belonged to no human language. They predated Sanskrit, predated civilization itself, syllables that made the candle flames dance without wind and turned the air thick as honey. The temperature dropped until our breath misted, but sweat beaded on Edmund's forehead as he continued the incantation. The photograph began to smoke. Then she stepped out of it. Rebecca Hartley materialized in the circle like she was walking through an invisible doorway. 7 years old, blonde pigtails, wearing the yellow dress Edmund had buried her in. She looked exactly as I remembered from faculty picnics, except for her eyes. Where warm brown irises should have been, there were only mirrors, perfect, reflective surfaces that showed not your face, but your deepest regrets. "Daddy," she said in that sweet, familiar voice, extending arms that cast no shadow. "I've missed you so much." Edmund sobbed as he knelt beside the painted circle. "Rebecca, my darling, my baby girl, I found a way to bring you back." "I know," she replied, her mirror eyes reflecting scenes of Edmund, alone in this office night after night, studying forbidden texts and making chalk marks on stone floors. "You've been so lonely without me." That's when I noticed her fingers. They were too long, with too many joints, ending in nails that looked like they'd been carved from black pearls. When she reached for Edmund's face, those impossible hands passed right through the circle's boundary. "Just say yes, Daddy," Rebecca whispered. "Say yes, and we can be together forever." Edmund was reaching for her when I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's not Rebecca." The thing wearing his daughter's face turned those terrible mirror eyes on me. In their depths, I saw myself at 17, kneeling beside a hospital bed where my mother lay dying of cancer. I saw the moment when I'd prayed for her recovery, when I'd offered God anything, my faith, my future, my life, if he would just let her live one more day. She died 6 hours later. Poor Dorian, the creature said in Rebecca's voice, still carrying that guilt, still wondering if you prayed hard enough, believed deeply enough. I could bring her back too, you know, both your parents. All you have to do is ask. For one terrible moment, I felt the pull of that offer. 23 years of grief crystallized into a single, overwhelming need to see my mother's face again. To tell her all the things I'd never had the chance to say. But then I looked at Edmund and saw how the creature's proximity was affecting him. His hair was turning white at the roots. Lines were appearing around his eyes, aging him years in seconds. Whatever bargain this thing was offering, it was already collecting payment. No, I said, stepping back from the circle. The word hung in the air like a physical force. The creature tilted its head with predatory curiosity. How unusual, it mused. Most humans leap at the chance for reunion. What makes you different, young scholar? Because I know the difference between love and hunger, I replied, backing toward the door. And you're starving. The beautiful mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. Writhing shadows with too many teeth, and a sound like breaking glass. Then Rebecca's face returned, sweet and innocent, and absolutely terrifying. "Daddy," it said, turning back to Edmund. "Don't listen to him, he doesn't understand. Say yes, and I'll come home." Edmund was already nodding when I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed the entire circle with chemical foam. The creature shrieked, not with Rebecca's voice, but with something that sounded like tearing metal, and dissolved into smoke that reeked of burned photographs. Edmund collapsed, his hair now completely white, his face aged a decade in minutes. He looked at me with eyes that held no recognition, no memory of what had just occurred. The last thing he said before the paramedics arrived was, "Rebecca? Where's Rebecca?" He spent his remaining years in a care facility, talking to visitors who weren't there and drawing pictures of a little girl who'd been dead for 3 years. I never went back to Cambridge. The church found me 3 days later. Father McKenna appeared at my flat like he'd been invited, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of a man who'd seen too much. He was 70-something, with hands scarred by burns that looked ritualistic and eyes the colour of winter storms. "Dr. Kells," he said, settling into my kitchen chair without invitation. "We need to talk." I'd been sitting in the dark since Edmund's breakdown, replaying that night and trying to convince myself it had been some kind of shared psychotic episode. McKenna's presence shattered that comfortable delusion. "You saw something," he continued, "something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught about the nature of divine reality." "I saw Edmund lose his mind," I said weakly. "You saw a parasite," McKenna corrected, "one of thousands that feed on human desperation. They've been with us since the first human looked at the stars and wondered if anyone was listening." He opened his satchel and withdrew a book bound in what looked like human skin. The cover bore no title, just symbols that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. "The church has always known," he explained. "We've simply chosen to fight this war in shadow, protecting the faithful from knowledge that might drive them to despair. But sometimes God calls specific individuals to take up arms against the darkness." That book contained everything. Binding rituals older than Christianity, protective wards that could stop cosmic entities in their tracks, and the true names of things that fed on human suffering. McKenna spent the next 6 months teaching me to forge chains from blessed iron, to carve protective symbols into obsidian blades, and to speak words of compulsion that could force even ancient entities to obey. "Remember," he said during my final lesson, they need consent. The universe itself requires that mortals choose their own damnation. This cosmic law is what allows our rituals to work. We're not overpowering them, we're using their own rules against them. The first time I used these techniques was in London, tracking something that called itself the Shepherd of Lost Lambs. It had been appearing to homeless children, offering them loving families in exchange for just a small piece of your dreams. I found it in an abandoned tube station surrounded by a dozen kids whose eyes had been replaced with swirling galaxies. They moved in perfect synchronization, their small hands weaving patterns in the air that made reality bend at the edges. The shepherd itself stood 9 feet tall, its body composed of what looked like living shadow, wrapped around a framework of silver bones. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off tunnel walls that suddenly stretched into impossible distances. "Another shepherd comes to tend the flock," it observed as I approached with my blessed chains. "How delightful. Perhaps you'd like to join our communion. I offer such beautiful dreams, visions of futures where pain doesn't exist and love never dies." "I'll pass," I said, beginning the binding ritual. The words I spoke were in Aramaic, then Latin, then languages that predated human civilization. Each syllable carried the weight of accumulated faith, the prayers of saints, the devotion of martyrs, the defiance of everyone who'd ever stood against the dark. The blessed chains erupted from my hands like living serpents, wrapping around the shepherd's shadowy form. Where they touched, its substance began to smoke and burn. The entity shrieked, and the sound shattered every piece of glass in the abandoned station. "Impossible," it gasped, struggling against the bindings. "I am eternal. I am beloved by these children. I am—" "Kneeling," I interrupted, forcing my will through the chains. The shepherd's legs buckled. As it sank to the tunnel floor, I drew the obsidian blade McKenna had taught me to carve and spoke the final words of banishment. The entity dissolved into ash and fading screams, taking its corrupted influence with it. The children collapsed unconscious but breathing, their natural eyes restored. They remembered nothing of their time in cosmic servitude, only dreams of a kind stranger who promised to take them somewhere safe. That was the beginning of everything. Over the next 20 years, I tracked down and destroyed 46 more entities. Each one left its mark, ritual scars that burned with phantom fire, memories that no human mind should contain, and the constant knowledge that somewhere in the world, another desperate soul was about to trade everything for nothing. I learned to recognize their calling cards, impossible wealth that appeared overnight, miraculous healings that came with hidden costs, love that burned too bright and consumed everything it touched. I developed a network of contacts, priests who shared McKenna's calling, researchers who studied the spaces between dimensions, and survivors who'd escaped their bargains with just enough sanity left to warn others. The entities themselves were endlessly creative in their methods, but identical in their hunger. The merchant of midnight sold good luck that always ran out at the worst possible moment. The weaver of hearts twisted love into obsession that destroyed families from within. The architect of sorrows built beautiful buildings that slowly drove their inhabitants insane. But they all shared one crucial weakness. They needed human choice. Every bargain required consent, every miracle demanded payment, every blessing came with strings attached. This cosmic law was what made my binding rituals possible. I wasn't defeating them through superior power, but by turning their own rules against them. Each victory taught me something new about the nature of these creatures. They weren't gods in any meaningful sense, they were cosmic parasites that had learned to speak in divine language. True divinity, I came to understand, doesn't bargain. It doesn't make deals. It doesn't require payment for love. These things did. This understanding sustained me through decades of hunting, through nights when I wondered if I was simply trading one form of madness for another. Every scar I bore was evidence that someone had chosen hope over despair, even if they didn't know it. Every destroyed entity meant fewer desperate people would face impossible choices, until Prague changed everything. The reports reached me on a humid Wednesday in late September. Viktor Petrovsky, a merchant in the old quarter, had gone from bankruptcy to impossible wealth in the span of a week. His wife Anna had died of a mysterious illness the same day his fortune appeared. Local gossips whispered about cursed gold and voices in the cemetery that promised everything for a price. I found Victor's shop after midnight, its windows glowing with warm light despite the late hour. He sat hunched over a counting table, surrounded by stacks of gold coins that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. His hands were raw and blistered, as if the metal burned him, but he couldn't stop touching his cursed wealth. When I entered, he looked up with eyes that held the particular madness of the damned. Not insanity, but the terrible clarity that comes from understanding exactly how much you've lost. "You'll hear about Anna," he said in English, heavily accented with grief. No surprise, no questions about who I was or how I'd found him. The guilty always expect judgment. "Tell me about the voice," I said, settling across from him. Victor's story spilled out like confession. 3 nights ago he'd knelt beside Anna's grave in Olsani Cemetery weeping for the woman he'd loved for 27 years and the debts that threatened to destroy everything they built together. That's when she came to him. A woman of impossible beauty speaking from the shadows between headstones. "Skin like polished marble," Victor whispered, his burned fingers still caressing the gold. Hair that moved without wind. Eyes that held depths I cannot describe. She said her heart ached for my suffering, that she wished to grant me the wealth to honor Anna's memory properly. The entity had offered him a choice. Watch Anna die slowly from the consumption already growing in her lungs, or accept enough gold to live like a king in exchange for the years your wife had remaining. Victor, mad with grief and facing financial ruin, had accepted without understanding the terms. The moment he agreed, the creature had reached across space and time to collect what was owed. Anna's remaining years, the years she might have fought the disease and won, the decades they could have spent growing old together, all of it consumed by the entity's endless hunger. "She died that very night," Victor continued, rips cutting tracks through days of accumulated grime. "Peacefully," they said, but I felt her leaving, felt something precious torn away and fed to that beautiful monster. He looked at me with desperate hope. "Can you save me? Can you bring her back?" I'd answered this question countless times before. The response never got easier. "I can't undo what's been done," I said gently, "but I can make sure the thing that took her pays for its crime." Victor nodded, accepting what he'd already known. "It calls to me. Every night it whispers my name and draws me back to where we first met. The gold burns my hands, but I cannot release it. The contract binds me to carry my fortune until the final payment comes due." I opened my satchel and began arranging the tools of my trade. 20 years of experience had taught me to prepare for every possibility. Chains forged from iron blessed by dying priests, obsidian blades sharp enough to cut through spiritual matter, salt that had never known sunlight, and the horn carved from Saint Erasmus's own bones. "Tonight," I said, "we end this." The ruins of St. Bartholomew Cathedral crouched on Prague's outskirts like a wounded beast. Communist-era fires had gutted the interior, leaving skeletal walls and empty windows that framed the night sky, like accusations against heaven. Victor led me through the broken nave to where the altar had once stood, now just a pile of rubble, beneath stars that seemed dimmer than they should. "Here," he whispered, "this is where it told me to come when the moon reaches its peak." The air began to change as midnight approached. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted with the absolute cold of deep space. of places where light went to die. My ritual scars began to burn in familiar warning, each one a previous victory against the forces that would devour human hope. The entity manifested slowly, like a photograph developing in reverse. Golden veins spread across the charred cathedral walls, pulsing with alien life. The creature that emerged from shadow was everything Victor had described and infinitely worse. Its beauty was the kind that destroyed minds, features so perfect they seemed like a mockery of human aesthetics. Skin that gleamed like molten brass, hair that flowed with movements that followed no earthly physics, and a crown woven from human finger bones held together with threads of solidified starlight. But it was the names that marked this entity as something far beyond the usual parasites I hunted. Carved into each bone of its crown were thousands upon thousands of identities, everyone who'd ever made a bargain with its servants over the past 4 millennia. This wasn't just another predator. This was royalty among monsters. Victor Petrosky, it spoke, and its voice echoed from every surface in the ruined cathedral, while somehow remaining intimate as a lover's whisper. You have carried your burden faithfully. The gold has marked you as mine, bound you to our eternal contract. Now comes the moment of final collection. The entity reached toward Victor with fingers that trailed golden fire, but I stepped between them, its attention fixed on me with the weight of geological time, and I felt the pressure of intelligence so vast it made human thought feel like sparks in an ocean. Another shepherd, it observed with something like amusement. How many of my children have you destroyed, little priest? 7? 12? Do you truly believe your small victories matter in the scope of eternity? 46, I corrected, drawing my blessed chains. And yes. The thing that called itself divine laughed, and the sound turned the cathedral's remaining glass windows to powder. I am the merchant of sorrows, it proclaimed, spreading arms that cast shadows in directions that violated geometry. I have walked among your pathetic species since before you learned to make fire. I have been worshipped in temples older than civilization, feared by prophets and loved by those wise enough to accept my gifts. Then you can kneel for just as long, I replied, beginning the binding ritual. The words flowed from my lips in languages that predated human speech. Each syllable carried 20 years of accumulated faith. The prayers of dying priests, the defiance of martyrs, the simple courage of ordinary people who'd chosen to stand against impossible darkness. The blessed chains erupted from my hands like striking vipers, wrapping around the merchant's beautiful form. Where they touched, its flesh began to smoke and crack. The entity's perfect features twisted into something ancient and furious as it struggled against the bindings. Impossible, it snarled, its voice now carrying harmonics that made the ruined walls weep golden tears. I am eternal. I am beloved. I am falling, I interrupted, pouring my will through the sacred iron. The battle that followed nearly destroyed what remained of the cathedral. The merchant of sorrows fought with the fury of something that had ruled through beauty and terror for 4,000 years. It hurled flames that burned without heat and darkness that blinded without shadow, trying everything in its vast repertoire of cosmic power. But the chains held firm, each link inscribed with prayers in 12 different languages and cooled in water that had never seen artificial light. As the entity's legs began to buckle, I drew my obsidian blade and prepared to speak the final words of banishment. The merchant looked up at me with something that might have been respect. You are stronger than most, it admitted, its voice now small and pathetic. But you understand nothing. You think this is a war between good and evil, but it's simply survival. We feed because we must, just as you breathe because you cannot help it. The difference, I said, pressing the blade to its throat, is that breathing doesn't require the suffering of others, doesn't it? The entity smiled, even as my blade began to burn through its flesh. Tell me, little priest, when you force cosmic beings to kneel before your will, how is that different from what we do to humans? In both cases, a desperate creature is compelled to surrender to power greater than themselves. The words hit like physical blows. For 20 years, I'd told myself I was different from the entities I hunted, that my cause was righteous while theirs was evil. But the merchant's observation carried uncomfortable truth. The difference, I said, struggling to find solid ground, is that I protect the innocent. Do you? It gestured weakly toward Victor, who knelt frozen beside the altar. This man traded his wife's life for gold of his own free will. How was he innocent? How were any of them innocent? I thought of all the people I'd saved over the years, desperate souls who'd made terrible bargains because they saw no other choice. Had they truly been victims, or simply humans, willing to pay any price for their heart's desire? They didn't understand the consequences, I said. Neither do you, the merchant replied. You bind cosmic entities with rituals taught by men who feared what they couldn't control. You speak words in languages you barely comprehend, wielding power you've never questioned. Tell me, when you first forced one of my kind to kneel, what did you feel? The memory surfaced unbidden. The shepherd of lost lambs, falling to its knees in that abandoned tube station. The look of absolute terror in its alien eyes as it realized its fate. And yes, beneath my determination to save those children, there had been something else. Something that felt disturbingly like satisfaction. Power, the merchant whispered. The intoxicating rush of making something cosmic submit to your will. You felt it then, and you feel it now. How long before that power corrupts you completely? How long before you decide that humans should kneel as well? I drove the obsidian blade through its throat, cutting off its poisonous words. The merchant of sorrows dissolved into ash and fading screams, its crown of bones crumbling until nothing remained but memory. But its final warning echoed in my mind as I helped Victor to his feet. The cursed gold had already turned to worthless brass in his hands, the contract broken by his creditor's destruction. He would live, but he would carry the weight of his choice forever, as would I. 2 weeks later, reports reached me from Zelena Hora, a mining town in the Carpathians, where impossible things were happening. Children playing with perfect coordination despite having their eyes replaced with polished stones. Families whose dying members woke healthy, but fundamentally changed. Miners hearing songs from depths where no human voice should reach. I should have known the Merchant of Sorrows was just the beginning. The train to Slovakia gave me time to process what the entity had said about the nature of power and corruption. For 20 years, I'd told myself I was different from the creatures I hunted. But was I? Every binding ritual was an act of dominance. Every forced submission, a demonstration of cosmic authority. The thought followed me through mountain passes and pine forests until I reached Zelena Hora on a Thursday that felt heavy with unspoken dread. The town looked normal at first glance. Red-tiled roofs clustered around a central square. Church bells marking the hours. The skeletal framework of mining equipment crowning the mountain above. But underneath the veneer of ordinary life, something fundamental had shifted. Children played in the square with movements that flowed like water, their games requiring no verbal communication because they seemed to share a collective understanding. When one child stumbled, others moved to catch them before gravity could complete its work. I approached a group of them kneeling to their level, with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades investigating supernatural corruption. "Hello," I said to a girl of perhaps 8 years old. "What's your name?" "Katka Novakova," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies no human throat should produce. When she looked at me, I saw that her eyes had been replaced with polished obsidian mirrors that reflected not my face but scenes of things that hadn't happened yet. "Those are unusual eyes, Katka," I said carefully. How long have you been able to see without them? Since the dreamer began singing, she said matter-of-factly. We don't need flesh eyes anymore. We can see everything now, past, present, and the beautiful shapes of futures that want to be born. She gestured to her playmates, and I saw they all shared the same reflective gaze. One boy was juggling stones that hung in mid-air longer than physics allowed. A girl drew patterns in the dirt that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own life. The dreamer, I asked. The one who sleeps in the deep places, Katka explained. It dreams of a world where no one suffers, where everyone has exactly what they need. All it asks is that we help it reshape things according to perfect design. At the local inn, I found Elena Kovar preparing lunch with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Her daughter Petra sat in the corner, drawing with both hands simultaneously, intricate pictures that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Mrs. Kovar, I said, settling at a table by the window. I'm researching unusual phenomena in mountain communities. I understand there have been some remarkable events here recently. Elena's face went pale. She glanced nervously at her daughter, then leaned close to speak in hushed tones. You're not the first to come asking, she whispered. Men from the university, researchers from Prague, even a priest from the Vatican. They all went into the mine to investigate. None of them came back out, but sometimes we hear their voices joining the song. She straightened, speaking louder for appearances. Petra wasn't always ambidextrous. She was born with a withered left arm that hung useless for 8 years. We prayed every night for a miracle. Her voice dropped to a whisper again. Then the singing started 3 months ago. She woke up with 2 perfect arms and abilities that shouldn't be possible. Watch. Petra held up her latest drawing. A perfect reproduction of the inn's interior, complete with details she couldn't see from her corner position. But as I watched, the tiny figures began to move. The drawing, Elena and drawing Dorian, turned to look at each other, their mouths moving in silent conversation that perfectly matched our actual words. She draws things before they happen, Elena continued, pulling out another picture. This one showed a man emerging from a cave mouth, his eyes replaced with the same obsidian mirrors as the children. Behind him marched dozens of other figures, all singing in perfect harmony. My husband Thomas, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. He went down into the mine 4 days ago to thank whatever had blessed our family. But I hear his voice sometimes late at night, singing with the others. It's so beautiful now, so pure. That evening I prepared for descent, with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that preparation was the difference between salvation and damnation. My satchel contained 20 years of accumulated knowledge, blessed chains, obsidian blades, sanctified salt, the horn of St. Erasmus, and something new, a vial of water taken from the river Jordan and blessed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem himself. The mine entrance yawned like a wound in the mountainside, surrounded by rusted equipment and warning signs in Slovak. The elevator had been sabotaged, its cables cut, and safety mechanisms destroyed by whatever didn't want visitors reaching the depths. I rappelled down the main shaft using rope blessed by Father McKenna before his death. The deeper I descended, the more reality began to bend at the edges. Rock walls pulsed like living tissue, and moisture seeped from stone that tasted of copper and ancient sacrifice. Carvings appeared along the tunnel walls, not made by human tools but grown from the rock itself, like tumours of meaning. They depicted scenes spanning millennia, cave dwellers kneeling before towering shadows, medieval peasants offering children to creatures of living darkness, modern families trading their humanity for impossible gifts. The images moved when viewed peripherally, telling stories of bargains made and prices paid across the entire history of human desperation. I forced myself to look away and continue deeper into the mountain's heart. At 700 feet below ground, I found the first of the missing researchers. Dr. Pavel Moravec hung suspended in a web of crystalline threads that grew from the cavern walls like spider silk made of living glass. His eyes had been replaced with the familiar obsidian mirrors, and his mouth moved in silent harmony with sounds echoing from deeper in the mountain. When I approached, his reflective gaze fixed on me with terrible awareness. "Brother," he said in a voice like wind chimes, "you've come to join our great work. How wonderful. The dreamer has been composing a song just for you." "What dreamer?" I asked, though dread was already providing answers. "The one who sleeps in the deep places, who dreams of perfection," Pavel replied. "No more suffering, no more death, no more ugly separation between desire and fulfillment. It only asks that we help it sing reality into better shapes." The crystalline bonds holding him began to glow brighter, and I heard footsteps approaching from deeper tunnels. More of the missing researchers and townspeople emerged from the darkness, their obsidian eyes reflecting my lantern light like a constellation of fallen stars. "Come," Pavel urged, extending a hand that ended in fingers of living crystal. "Let the dreamer show you wonders beyond imagination. Let it teach you the difference between the power you wield and the power you could become." I drew my blessed chains instead. The binding ritual echoed through the cavern system like thunder trapped in stone. My voice carried words older than written language, syllables that had been spoken when the world was young and humans first learned to say no to cosmic authority. The crystalline web holding Pavel began to smoke and crack. He screamed as the obsidian stones fell from his eye sockets like black tears, his humanity slowly returning as the entity's influence faded. But my true target wasn't Pavel or the other victims. I was calling to the thing that had corrupted them, challenging it to show itself, rather than hide behind stolen voices. From the deepest tunnel came a sound like continents grinding together, and I felt the mountain itself begin to tremble. Something vast and ancient was stirring in response to my challenge, something that had slumbered in the earth's bones since before humans learned to dream. The god of the pit emerged from darkness like geology, given malevolent life. It stood 18 feet tall, its body a fusion of flesh and mineral that defied every natural law. Mining equipment had grown into its form over centuries of dwelling in the deep places. Pickaxes formed its hands, chains grew from its skull like metallic dreadlocks, and ore carts were embedded in its chest like grotesque hearts that pulsed with volcanic rhythm. Its face was a shifting mass of stone and metal that occasionally resolved into human features before dissolving back into geological chaos. When it spoke, its voice made the cavern walls weep liquid mercury. "Mortal," it rumbled, each word sending tremors through solid rock. "You interrupt the great composition. These people have found harmony beyond their small, discordant lives. Their children will never know want. Their voices will carry perfect music to the surface world." "Perfect according to whom?" I challenged, setting down my lantern and drawing my weapons. "According to mathematics," the creature replied, gesturing to its crystalline servants. "According to cosmic law, according to the fundamental equations that govern reality itself. We offer optimization, evolution, the final solution to human suffering." The possessed townspeople began to advance with perfectly coordinated movements, their crystalline bonds glowing like fiber-optic cables. I had perhaps 20 seconds before they overwhelmed me through sheer numbers. I blew the horn of St. Erasmus. The sound that emerged existed in the space between matter and spirit, a vibration that could steal the voice from gods and return it to the silence from which all music springs. The god of the pit staggered backward as if struck by artillery, its command over the possessed instantly severed. The crystalline bonds holding the townspeople cracked and crumbled. Pavel collapsed to his knees, his natural eyes restored, but filled with memories of cosmic horror. The others fell unconscious but breathing, their humanity returning like morning light after endless night. But the god of the pit was far from finished. It lunged forward with impossible speed for something so massive, its pickaxe hands striking sparks that ignited pools of gas seeping from deeper caverns. I rolled aside and cast my blessed chains, watching them wrap around the creature's torso and burn through its mineral flesh like molten silver. The battle that followed nearly brought down the entire mountain. The god of the pit fought with fury accumulated over millennia, wielding powers that could reshape stone and metal at will. It caused the cavern ceiling to rain granite spears and turned the floor into a maze of crushing stone pillars. My blessed salt burned its flesh like acid. My obsidian blade carved deep wounds that bled liquid fire, but still it fought with desperate strength. The binding ritual required everything I had. Every prayer learned in seminary, every forbidden word gleaned from Father McKenna's books, every drop of will accumulated through 20 years of cosmic warfare. My ritual scars reopened and bled as I poured my life force into the sacred chains, forcing them to tighten around something that had ruled these depths since before Rome fell. Slowly, inevitably, the god of the pit's massive legs began to buckle. "This changes nothing," it gasped as it sank to its knees on the cavern floor. "You think you're saving them, but you're only delaying the inevitable. Humans create their own suffering faster than any cosmic force could devise. We offer solutions. You offer only prolonged agony." "Maybe," I admitted, raising the obsidian blade, "but the choice should be theirs to make." As I prepared to deliver the killing blow, the creature looked up with something that might have been respect. "Before you destroy me," it said, "know this, I am merely a herald. The throne of ash has watched your small war with growing interest. It finds your defiance instructive." I paused. "The throne of ash?" "The first and greatest of our kind," the god of the pit replied. "The one who taught your species to kneel before the very concept of divinity. It has been patient these many centuries, learning from the failures of servants like myself. Soon, very soon, it will offer you a bargain that makes all others seem like children's games." I drove the blade through its throat, cutting off whatever else it might have said. The god of the pit dissolved into mineral dust and fading echoes, its influence over the mountain finally broken. But as I helped the rescued townspeople reach the surface, its warning echoed in my mind like a funeral bell. The journey back to Prague gave me time to research what little information existed about the throne of ash. Most sources were fragmentary, references in Vatican archives, marginalia in books the church had tried to destroy, whispers in languages that predated civilization. What I found terrified me more than anything I'd faced in 20 years of hunting. The throne of ash wasn't just another cosmic parasite. It was the template from which all others had sprung, the original entity that had taught humanity the difference between worship and servitude. Ancient texts described it as the first being to offer mortals power in exchange for submission, the creature that had shown early humans how to kneel. But more disturbing were the accounts of its imprisonment. 2,000 years ago, Roman legions and early Christian monks had somehow managed to bind it, using a combination of faith, sacrifice, and knowledge that had since been lost. They'd built the first shrine on the Adriatic coast to contain it, establishing what would eventually become the monastery of Saint Erasmus. For centuries, the entity had remained trapped, forced to channel its power into blessings that helped human civilization flourish. But as faith waned and the old knowledge was forgotten, the bindings had weakened. The throne of ash had learned patience, sending out lesser servants to test humanity's defenses while slowly corrupting its captors from within. The final entry in Father McKenna's private notes chilled my blood. The seals grow weak. When the last priest who remembers the true words dies, it will be free to walk the earth again. God help us all. Father McKenna had died 5 years ago. 3 days after returning from Slovakia, I found a letter waiting at my hotel. It bore no postmark, no return address, and the paper felt wrong beneath my fingers. Too warm, too smooth, as if it had been crafted from something that had never been truly alive. The message was written in my own handwriting. Dorian Kells, your reputation precedes you. After 20 years of hunting my children, surely you're curious about the parent. I extend an invitation to visit the monastery of St. Erasmus on the Croatian coast. Come alone, come prepared. It's time we discussed terms. I burned the letter immediately, but the words remained branded in my memory. The monastery of St. Erasmus, the source of the relic I'd carried for over a decade. If the Throne of Ash had chosen that location for our meeting, it wasn't coincidence. The journey to Croatia took 3 days by train and rented car, winding through mountain passes that seemed to grow more desolate with each mile. The monastery of St. Erasmus, perched on cliffs that had been sacred since before Rome existed, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of salt spray and storms that carried whispers from places mortals weren't meant to see. Local legends spoke of Roman soldiers who'd imprisoned something terrible in the depths below, building their shrine on a site where reality wore thin. Fishermen reported seeing lights in the monastery windows, despite its abandonment, and hearing voices singing hymns in languages that made their teeth ache. As I approached the massive oak doors, I could hear it, a low, thrumming chant that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The sound wasn't audible in any conventional sense, but rather a vibration that resonated in the space between thought and feeling. The interior was a museum of human faith spanning millennia. Every surface was covered with murals that told the story of humanity's relationship with the divine, from primitive cave paintings to Renaissance masterpieces. But these weren't normal religious art. They shifted subtly when viewed peripherally, depicting scenes that changed based on the observer's attention. I followed the murals like chapters in a book, reading the visual history of humanity's first encounter with the entity now known as the Throne of Ash. The earliest images showed primitive humans cowering before a shadow that blotted out stars. Later paintings depicted Roman legions locked in battle against something that couldn't be killed by conventional weapons. The most disturbing murals showed the creature's eventual capture. Through some combination of faith, sacrifice, and desperate ingenuity, ancient humans had managed to bind it, using chains forged from the prayers of dying saints. The entity was forced to serve rather than rule, its vast power channeled into blessings that helped civilization flourish. But the paintings also revealed what happened when knowledge was lost. As generations passed and faith weakened, the bindings deteriorated. The Throne of Ash learned patience, adapting its methods from direct conquest to subtle corruption. It began sending out lesser servants to test humanity's defenses while slowly working to free itself. In the monastery's deepest chamber, I found evidence of the creature's growing influence. The walls were covered with names carved in dozens of languages, everyone who'd ever accepted a bargain from one of its servants over the past 2 millennia. Victor Petrosky's name was there, still bleeding fresh. So were thousands of others I'd failed to save. At the center of the chamber stood a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. It was empty, but the air around it shimmered with residual power that made my ritual scars burn. This was where the Throne of Ash had waited during its imprisonment, slowly corrupting its captors while appearing to serve them. Magnificent craftsmanship, don't you think? I spun around, hand already moving toward my weapons, to find Professor Edmund Hartley standing in the chamber doorway. He looked exactly as he had 23 years ago. Same tweed jacket, same gentle smile, same warm, brown eyes that had once guided me through theological complexities. But I knew this wasn't really Hartley. I'd watched him die, watched something wearing his daughter's face drain away his essence. "Hello, Dorian," he said, stepping into the chamber with familiar academic grace. "You've certainly grown into an impressive theologian, though I must say your methodology has strayed rather far from traditional scholarship." "You're not Edmund Hartley," I stated, drawing the obsidian blade with practiced efficiency. The thing wearing Hartley's face chuckled, a sound that was heartbreakingly familiar yet fundamentally wrong. "Death is such a limited concept. I prefer to think of poor Edmund as having undergone a career change. He serves me now in ways he never could, while constrained by mortality." "Show me your true form," I demanded, beginning the opening syllables of a binding ritual. "But this is my true form," it replied, settling onto the obsidian throne with casual ease. "Or rather, one of them. You see, Dorian, I'm not bound by the crude limitations that constrain my offspring. I am possibility itself, the space between what is and what could be." As it spoke, the chamber began to transform. Walls stretched upward into impossible heights while the carved names started glowing with internal fire. The air grew thick with accumulated suffering, every bargain ever made resonating in the ancient stones. "I am the throne of ash," it continued, its voice now carrying harmonics that made my bones vibrate. "I am the first and greatest of my kind, the entity your species learned to call divine before you understood the difference between worship and subjugation." The false Hartley stood, and as it rose, its form began to shift and expand. The familiar professor's body stretched upward, growing to 12 feet in height while maintaining human proportions. Its skin became something between flesh and shadow, shifting states like smoke given temporary form. Most terrifying was the crown that materialized, not carved bone like its servants wore, but antlers of burning ash that reached towards the chamber ceiling. Each branch was etched with thousands upon thousands of names, representing everyone who'd ever made a bargain across centuries of human desperation. "You have been wonderfully entertaining, God-killer," the Throne of Ash said, settling back onto its stone seat. 23 years of hunting my children, forcing them to kneel before your righteous fury. Each victory has made you stronger, more skilled, more certain of your divine mission." I raised the obsidian blade, but the creature merely smiled with Hartley's stolen features. "Oh, my dear student, did you truly believe those victories were earned through your own merit? Every entity you've destroyed, every binding ritual you've mastered, every soul you've saved, all of it has been orchestrated according to my design." The words struck like physical blows. "That's impossible, is it?" The Throne of Ash gestured to the glowing names surrounding us. "Examine the patterns, Dorian. See how each victory led to greater challenges, how every success taught you skills you'd need for more powerful adversaries. I've been sculpting you, molding you into the perfect instrument of cosmic will." Against my better judgment, I found myself studying the chamber walls. The names weren't randomly distributed. They formed intricate spirals that converged toward the throne itself, and at the center of each spiral, carved in letters of burning gold, my name. "You've been preparing me," I whispered as the horrible truth settled over me. "Preparing you to serve," the Throne of Ash confirmed. "You see, I learned something crucial during my centuries of imprisonment. Direct conquest always fails because humans possess an irritating tendency towards heroism. But corruption is eternal." The entity rose and began pacing around me in a slowly tightening circle. With each step, the chamber walls pressed closer, the weight of accumulated despair growing heavier. "Every false god you've destroyed has fed its power into you," it continued. "Every binding ritual has taught you to speak with the voice of ultimate authority. Every victory has convinced you that you are humanity's shepherd, that your cause is righteous and just." I tried to activate my blessed chains, but they felt cold and lifeless in my hands. The obsidian blade seemed to grow heavier with each heartbeat. "What you haven't realized," the Throne of Ash said, stopping directly before me, is that righteousness and tyranny are separated by the thinnest of margins. You've spent decades forcing cosmic entities to submit to your will. How long before you decide that humans should submit as well? The question hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. I wanted to deny it immediately, to assert my moral certainty, but the entity's words carried uncomfortable weight. How many times had I looked at desperate people making bargains and felt not just pity, but contempt? How many times had I wondered whether humanity deserved salvation at all? "You're wrong," I said, but conviction was bleeding out of my voice. "Am I?" The Throne of Ash smiled with devastating gentleness. "Tell me, what is the fundamental difference between your binding rituals and the contracts my servants offer? In both cases, a desperate being is compelled to surrender their will to a superior power." The chamber walls continued their inexorable approach, and I realized with growing horror that the entity was absolutely right. Every time I'd forced a cosmic predator to kneel, I'd exercised the same fundamental dominance they used to enslave humans. The only difference was the direction of the power flow. "The difference," I said, struggling to find solid moral ground, "is that I protect innocent people." "Do you?" The Throne of Ash gestured to the thousands of names glowing around us. How many of these souls sought out my children of their own free will? How many made their bargains knowing exactly what they were trading away? I thought of Victor Petrovsky, clutching his burning gold while his wife's years drained away. Had he been innocent or simply desperate enough to justify any choice? I thought of Elena Kovar, whose gratitude for her daughter's healing had blinded her to the supernatural cost. "They couldn't understand the full consequences," I protested weakly. "Neither do you," the Throne of Ash replied. "You wield binding rituals learned from books written by men who feared what they couldn't comprehend. You speak words in languages you don't truly understand, channeling power whose source you've never questioned." The entity reached out with one impossibly long finger and touched the center of my chest, directly over the oldest of my ritual scars. The mark blazed with sudden, terrible clarity. "This scar," it said softly, "do you remember the moment you received it?" The memory surfaced unbidden. My third hunt. A creature calling itself the Shepherd of Lost Children. It had been corrupting orphans in a London workhouse, offering them perfect families in exchange for their capacity to dream. When I bound it with blessed chains, it had fought back in desperation, raking claws across my chest before I could complete the banishment. "You told yourself the pain was necessary," the Throne of Ash continued. "A small price for the children's salvation. But what you felt in that moment, when the chains first took hold, and the entity screamed in anguish, was it truly righteousness, or something far more intoxicating?" The memory crystallized with unwelcome clarity. The Shepherd of Lost Children, magnificent and terrible, falling to its knees as my binding ritual took hold. The look of absolute terror in its inhuman eyes, as it realized its fate. And yes, beneath my determination to save the orphans, there had been something else, something that felt disturbingly like satisfaction. "Power," the Throne of Ash whispered. "The power to make gods kneel. The power to decide who deserves salvation and who merits destruction. The power to reshape reality according to your moral vision." The chamber walls were now close enough that I could feel their heat against my shoulders. The carved names pressed in like grasping fingers, each one representing a soul consumed by the hunger for something greater than themselves. "I offer you a choice, Dorian Kells," the entity said, resuming its seat on the obsidian throne. "Continue your futile crusade against my kind, watching helplessly as more desperate humans make bargains you cannot prevent, or accept what you were always destined to become." "Which is?" "My successor," the Throne of Ash said simply. "The next evolution of divine authority. You have proven yourself capable of binding cosmic entities, of speaking with the voice of ultimate judgment. Why should such power be limited to creatures like myself? The entity gestured, and the chamber walls suddenly expanded back to their original positions. But now I could see beyond them, through the monastery stones to the world outside. Visions flashed before my eyes. Humanity as it truly existed, desperate and grasping, and endlessly cruel. Wars fought over resources that could be shared. Children starving while others lived in obscene luxury. Love corrupted by jealousy. Faith poisoned by fanaticism. Hope twisted into delusion. They create their own suffering, the Throne of Ash observed. They make bargains with each other far more destructive than anything my servants have ever offered. Wouldn't it be merciful to provide proper guidance, to compel them to kneel before a benevolent authority capable of ending their pain? The vision shifted, showing me what the world could become under enlightened management. No more war, because conflict would be impossible. No more hunger, because resources would be distributed according to perfect wisdom. No more suffering, because humans would finally understand their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. All it would require was submission. Universal, absolute submission to the kind of power I'd spent 23 years learning to wield. Consider the good you could accomplish, the entity continued. No more chasing after individual servants, while countless others slip through your fingers. No more watching desperate people make terrible choices because they lack proper guidance. You could prevent the bargains from being necessary in the first place. I found myself genuinely considering the offer. How many people had I failed to save over the years? How many Viktor Petrovskis had made their deals while I was hunting other threats? How many families had been destroyed while I was too far away to intervene? What exactly would I have to do? I asked. The Throne of Ash smiled with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Simply kneel, it said. Acknowledge my authority, and I will share with you the power to reshape humanity according to divine will. Together, we can create a world where bargains become unnecessary, because everyone will have exactly what they truly need. I stared at the entity wearing Professor Hartley's beloved face, feeling the weight of 23 years pressing down on my shoulders. Every scar on my body burned with phantom fire. Every victory I'd won felt suddenly hollow, just another move in a game orchestrated by something infinitely more cunning than I'd imagined. The blessed chains hung limp and useless in my hands. The obsidian blade felt heavier than mountain stone. Around me, the names of the damned pulsed with golden light, each one a reminder of my fundamental failures. I thought of Viktor Petrovsky, clutching his cursed wealth. I thought of Elena Kovar, grateful for her daughter's impossible gifts. I thought of all the desperate souls who'd made bargains, because the world had failed them so completely that damnation seemed preferable to despair. And I thought of something else, something the Throne of Ash had overlooked in its perfect manipulations. You're absolutely right, I said quietly. The entity leaned forward with obvious satisfaction. I knew you would eventually see reason, my dear student. You're right about the power, I continued, about the similarities between what I do and what your servants do, about the satisfaction I feel when I force something cosmic to kneel before my will. I raised the obsidian blade, feeling its familiar weight in my scarred hand. But you made one crucial error in your calculations, I said, meeting the entity's stolen gaze. You assumed that recognizing the corrupting nature of power would make me embrace it. Instead, it's shown me exactly what I need to sacrifice. Before the Throne of Ash could react, I drove the blade deep into my own chest. Divine power erupted from the self-inflicted wound like liquid lightning. For 23 years, I'd been unknowingly carrying fragments of every entity I'd destroyed, accumulating their strength without realizing the growing weight. Now that power poured out of my body in torrents, turning the chamber into a storm of spiritual energy. But more than stolen strength, I was offering myself as a willing sacrifice, channeling the accumulated faith of every priest who'd bless my weapons, every saint whose relics I carried, every believer who died protecting humanity from cosmic predators. The throne of ash shrieked as waves of purified divine energy washed over it. For the first time in its existence, it was experiencing something it couldn't corrupt or control. Genuine self-sacrifice made without expectation of reward. Impossible, it snarled, Hartley's false face dissolving into something writhing and furious. You cannot resist my logic. I am eternal. I am inevitable. I am... Finished, I interrupted, pouring my life force into the most powerful binding ritual ever attempted. The blessed chains erupted from my dying body with supernatural force, but these weren't the bonds I'd forged in monastery fires. These were restraints of pure sacrifice, stronger than any metal, because they were freely given by someone who understood the true cost of power. The throne of ash fought against the binding with desperate fury, its crown of burning antlers casting wild shadows as it struggled. Ancient knowledge, accumulated over millennia of cosmic dominance, proved useless against the simple human act of choosing death over dominion. You have accomplished nothing, it gasped as the chains tightened around its essence. Destroy me, and others will rise to take my place. Humanity will always need something to kneel before, something to blame for their failures. Maybe, I admitted, watching the entity's massive form begin to collapse, but they won't kneel before you. I spoke the final words of banishment in a voice that carried the prayers of countless believers, the defiance of every human who'd ever said no to absolute authority. The throne of ash screamed as it began to dissolve, its stolen power flowing back into the world it had tried to dominate for millennia. This changes nothing, it whispered with its last breath. Others will come. Others will offer the same bargains to the same desperate people. You have saved no one. I've saved myself, I replied, and I've shown them it's possible. The throne of ash crumbled into dust and silence, taking with it the carved names of its victims and the oppressive weight of accumulated despair. The chamber walls returned to ordinary stone, and the supernatural darkness faded into mundane shadow. I collapsed beside the empty throne, the obsidian blade still buried in my chest. Blood flowed from the wound in a steady stream, carrying with it the last traces of power I'd accumulated over 2 decades of cosmic warfare. The ritual scars covering my body began to fade as the entity's influence finally left me. For the first time in 23 years, I felt truly human, weak, mortal, and completely ordinary. The monastery began to collapse around me as ancient supports, held in place by supernatural force, finally succumbed to centuries of neglect. I managed to crawl through falling stones to reach the surface where dawn was breaking over the Adriatic in shades of gold and crimson. A passing fisherman found me on the rocky shore and called for help. I spent 2 weeks in a Croatian hospital while doctors tried to explain how I'd survived what should have been a fatal chest wound. The blade had somehow missed every vital organ, they said. A miracle, they called it. I knew better. Some prices are too important to be paid in full. During my recovery, I waited for signs that other entities were moving to fill the vacuum left by their master's destruction. I expected reports of new bargains, fresh miracles, desperate people trading their souls for temporary relief from suffering. The reports never came. Perhaps the throne of ash had been the keystone holding their entire system together. Perhaps my sacrifice had somehow severed their connection to humanity's desperation. Or perhaps they'd simply decided that a species capable of producing someone willing to die rather than rule wasn't worth the effort. 6 months later, I returned to England and took a position teaching theology at a small college in the Cotswolds. Not Cambridge. I could never return there, not with Professor Hartley's memory haunting every hall. But a quiet place where I could share what I'd learned about the difference between divine guidance and cosmic manipulation. My students think I'm eccentric, with my stories about false gods and binding rituals that they assume are elaborate metaphors for spiritual struggle. But sometimes former priests attend my lectures, men and women who recognize the faded scars on my hands and the weight in my words. They never ask direct questions, but occasionally one will approach after class to mention strange occurrences in their parish. A miracle that feels somehow wrong. A blessing that comes with hidden costs. A voice in the darkness offering exactly what someone needs most. When that happens, I give them Father McKenna's books and teach them how to forge chains from blessed iron. I show them where to find salt that has never known artificial light, and how to carve obsidian blades sharp enough to cut through spiritual matter. I tell them the words that can force even gods to kneel. Because although the great entities may have withdrawn from our world, smaller parasites still slip through the cracks in human desperation. People still make terrible bargains when they see no other choice, and somewhere someone needs to know how to say no to cosmic authority. The network continues, passed down from teacher to student, priest to priest, hunter to hunter. We are ordinary humans, armed with extraordinary knowledge, standing guard against the darkness that would devour everything we hold dear. My name is Dorian Kells, and I no longer kill gods who bargain with humans, but I've taught others how to make them kneel. The wound in my chest never fully healed. It serves as a permanent reminder that some victories require sacrifice, that sometimes the only way to defeat a corrupt system is to remove yourself from it entirely. Every morning, when I dress for class, I see the scar in my mirror and remember the choice I made. The choice to remain human. I'm telling you this story now because the reports are starting again. Miracles in remote villages. Impossible luck in desperate situations. Children drawing pictures of futures that shouldn't exist. The entities are returning, drawn by humanity's endless capacity for hope and despair. I'm too old now to hunt them myself. The wound I gave myself ensures that my fighting days are over. But you're listening to this recording, which means you're already asking the right questions. You've noticed that some miracles feel wrong. You've seen the look in people's eyes when they speak of bargains made in moments of crisis. You felt the pull of voices offering everything you've ever wanted in exchange for something you can't afford to lose. If you're hearing this, then you're probably the next guardian, the next teacher, the next person willing to stand between humanity and the things that would remake us in their image. The tools are still out there, hidden in monastery, archives and private collections. Father McKenna's books survive in libraries that don't officially exist. The knowledge of forging blessed chains is preserved in manuscripts written by monks who understood the true nature of divine warfare. All you need is the will to use them. All you need is the courage to say no when cosmic authority demands submission. But remember what I learned in that monastery chamber, what the Throne of Ash taught me about the corrupting nature of power. The greatest victory isn't forcing your enemies to kneel, it's choosing to kneel yourself. My name is Dorian Kells, and I have taught you what I can. The rest is up to you. Just remember, when you bind something cosmic, you bind part of yourself as well. When you make gods kneel, you risk becoming the very thing you're fighting against. The only way to truly win is to sacrifice the power you've gained for something greater than yourself. Choose wisely. Choose humanely. And never, ever let them convince you that submission is the same as worship. The recording ends here. What you do with this knowledge is your decision alone.